Masechet Avoda Zara Daf Mem Vav. Taneh Tana Kameh Derav Sheshat. A reciter of Tanaitic statements recited the following baraita in front of Rav Sheshat. Hagoyim haovdim teharim v'etagebaot hen mutarin v'ovdehem besaif. If a non-Jew worships a mountain or a hill, then the mountain and the hill remain permitted. It's something attached to the ground. It's something that is natural, not created by human beings, so you can't make a mountain prohibited. However, the idolaters who bowed down to it or worshipped it or made a sacrifice to it, they violated idolatry, so they get capital punishment by the sword. If, however, the idolaters worship plants and vegetables, then the plants and vegetables are prohibited, and also the idolaters are given capital punishment by the sword. That's the Braita. Amar le, Amar lach mani. Rav Sheshat asks, what is your source? Who told you this Baraita? What Tana is the author of this opinion? The answer is that this Baraita must be the opinion of Rabbi Yosef, the son of Yehuda, who says that if you planted a tree as a regular tree, and then afterwards someone worshipped it as idolatry, it is prohibited. And that's why over here you have these plants and vegetables that are planted in the ground, and they were planted just as regular plants and vegetables. And then someone came along and worshipped them, they became prohibited. That's why it says hen asurin. So it must be that Rabbi Yosef is the author of this Baraita. But we ask, why do you say that? Why not say that this Baraita could be according to everybody? Could be according to Rabbanan, who say that if everybody agrees that if you planted a tree to begin with as an idolatrous tree, then it's prohibited. So maybe here is talking about a case of plants and vegetables that were planted to begin with as to be idolatrous. La sakadatech. That katane dumya dehar mahar shelo neto metechila lekach afhai nameh shelo neto metechila lekach. No, don't think that, because it's comparing the mountain with the plants. Because over here, that's the first half is about the mountain, the second half is about plants and vegetables. So it has to be similar. Just like a mountain is not placed there to begin with to be for idolatry. Nobody creates a mountain. They're there from creation. And so they're there just to be a mountain, not to be idolatrous. So too, the plants and vegetables should be the same thing, that they are placed there just to be plants and vegetables, regular, and only afterwards someone came and made it into an idolatry. And therefore, this can't be Rabbanan, because Rabbanan would say that the plants and vegetables are permitted. So this must be the opinion only of Rabbi Yosef bar Yehuda. Itmar, Avnei har shenidaldelu be'enei Rabbi Chiya v'Rabbi Yochanan, hadamar asurot v'hadamar mutaros. The new topic is pieces of a mountain that were dislodged. You have a big boulder or rock that by itself, it just came off the mountain. What is the status of that? And this is a mountain that was worshipped as idolatry. We said before, the mountain by itself is permitted. You can't make a mountain prohibited. And but what about a rock that came off of the mountain? This is a machloket between the sons of Rabbi Chiya and Rabbi Yochanan. We don't know which one said which, but one of them said they're prohibited, and one of them said they are permitted. Now, whoever said permitted, what is their source? Kehar, mahar she'en bo tefisat yad adam, umutar, afane she'en bahen tefisat yad adam, umutarin. Well, it should be the same as a mountain. What's the reason that the mountain itself is permitted? Because it has no human involvement. There's no human that makes a mountain. It's just there. So too, boulders that came from a mountain. We're not talking about a case where a human came and hewed off a piece of the rock. If someone did that, then that would be in fact be prohibited. Every idol that's made out of rock or marble, that means a human came and chiseled off a piece and chiseled it off and made it idolatry. That certainly would be prohibited. We're not talking about that case. We're talking about a case where it naturally fell off a mountain. So there's no human involvement, so therefore it should be permitted. The same as a mountain, no human involvement. But we say, wait, that's not a good source. Ma leha sheken mechubad. That's different because a mountain is attached to the ground, whereas the boulder becomes detached, is not attached to the ground. Maybe the reason why a mountain remains permitted is because it's attached to the ground, but it will be prohibited when it's detached. Behema tochiach. Oh, we will prove it from a live animal. The law is that a live animal that is worshipped remains permitted for regular use. If someone has an animal and they start bowing down to it and sacrificing to it or whatever, then that animal, still, a Jew can go and take it and ride on it, use it for work, eat it. It does not become prohibited. We'll see later, a relevant halacha is that it does become prohibited to use as a korban. If an animal was worshipped, you cannot bring it as a korban. But that's a special law for gavoa, for a korban. But for regular use, it's permitted. And now, an animal is not attached to the ground, and yet it's permitted. So that's a proof that the boulder also is not attached to the ground, and it should be permitted. But we ask, wait a second, maybe the animal is different because it's alive, and a boulder is not alive. So maybe because something it's alive, that gives it importance, and this means that it cannot become idolatrous. A similar law, by analogy, is that an animal, the live animal, cannot become tameh. Even if it's carrying a dead body, a live animal can never become tameh. And so maybe also a live animal cannot become prohibited as idolatrous. So that's not the same as a boulder. Oh, but we could bring the mountain back because the mountain is not alive, and therefore, and yet it remains tahor. So the fact that the animal is alive is not a critical factor because the mountain is not alive and it remains tahor. Vechazar adin lo re'izeh k're'izeh v'lo re'izeh k're'izeh hasada sheben she'en behen tefisat yad yedei adam umutar of course she'en behen tefisat yedei adam umutar. And so now we take the unique aspects of both of these items and they cancel each other out. This one is not like that one and that one is not like this one. What's the common denominator between a mountain and a live animal? The common denominator is that they are natural things that are not created with human involvement. They are just there by nature, and they are both permitted. And it doesn't matter the fact that one's connected to the ground and one is alive, because the other one doesn't have that aspect. And therefore also a boulder, which is a natural thing, not with it doesn't have human involvement, should be permitted. Hold on. You cannot compare them because those two things, the mountain and the live animal, have not changed from their natural form. They are in their natural form. That's different from a boulder that got dislodged. It was no longer in its original state because it got dislodged. So maybe the fact that it changed means that it would have a different law, maybe be prohibited. Oh, so you know what? We can still use this kavachomer by comparing it to an animal that has a blemish. An animal has a blemish is no longer in its original state. An animal that has a blemish is kind of like a boulder that used to be attached and now it's not attached anymore. And an animal that has a blemish is also permitted, even if it's worshipped, it's permitted. And a mountain, which is, although it's connected to the ground, it's not alive. So those two things together can be a source for the boulder that's detached. Or we can learn that a boulder that detached from a mountain, even though it was worshipped as an idol, is permitted. And we can learn that from an unblemished animal, which, even though it's detached, it's still permitted. And we'll combine that with a withered tree that is attached to the ground, which, even if it was worshipped because it's attached to the ground, was not planted to be an idolatrous tree, and now it withered away, and so that changed from its natural form, but it remains permitted. So here's something that, even though it changed from its natural form, still is permitted. And so these two things together can be a source from which we can learn that a detached boulder is permitted. Good, so that's the source for permission. Uman da'asar, what's the source for the one who prohibits a boulder that got detached? Lehachi ketib shakes teshakesenu v'taib teta'abenu dafagav da'atya medina letera la tatya. We learn that from the pasuk that says anything it's an abomination, something avoda Zara, you shall detest, you shall abhor it. Why is it adding these words that you have to hate this thing? We already said you have to smash it, destroy it. These words come to teach us that something that is like a boulder that got detached from a mountain, even though you could bring a kal vachomer that we just brought to prove that it's permitted, still do not get any benefit from it. That's what it's coming to. You should hate even that. That's what these words are coming to include, and that's why once it's detached, it's prohibited. When it's part of the mountain is a natural thing and attached to the ground, and so it's permitted. But once it gets detached, this pasuk kicks in and said, I know you have a kal vachomer that says it's allowed. That kal vachomer is a good kal vachomer, but this pasuk overrides it. Tistayem de bnei Rabbi Chaya de Sharu de Chizkiya zakaf besad ishtachavot la mahu. We weren't sure before whether it was the sons of Rabbi Chaya or Rabbi Yochanan. Which one said which? Who said that the boulder that fell off the mountain is prohibited, and which one said permitted? We should conclude that it's the sons of Rabbi Chaya. They're the ones that said the boulder is permitted, because Chizkiya, he's one of the sons of Rabbi Chaya. He asked the following question, and from the question we can infer what he was said about the boulder. Now the question is about an egg. What we're going to do is we're going to compare an egg to a boulder. How are they the same? Well, both of them were once part of something and then were detached from it through a natural process. So just like the boulder was attached to the mountain, and the mountain is permitted, even if it's worshipped, but then the boulder separates from it, and then we didn't know what the status is. So too an egg is part of the chicken, and the chicken is a live animal, and therefore even if it's worshipped, is permitted. But now through a natural process, no human involvement, it separates off from it. Therefore, it's like the boulder. Now, if someone does something, there is human involvement. If someone would take this rock and then set it up, chisel it, make it into an idol with human involvement, certainly that would make it prohibited. And how about the egg? Well, it sounds like there should be a same law there. If you take the egg, make it into, paint it, whatever, and make it into an idolatrous egg, that would be prohibited. So here's the question, and we're going to explain what the proof is. If someone stood an egg up, you took a little stand, like the one that you use for soft-boiled eggs, and you put an egg in it with the purpose of that you're going to serve it as idolatry. But you didn't worship it yet, you didn't bow down to it yet. What is the status of that egg? Now, let's explain the proof. The proof is just from the question itself. Kasal gadatech lishtachavot la vishtachabad la vekame ba'yale haizikifata ihava maaseh ilava maaseh aval lo zakaf la mitasera shema'mina bene Rabbi Chaya de Sharu. For the purpose of the proof, let's assume that if the guy set it up in order to bow down to it, and in fact he bowed down to the egg, then he's wondering, the fact that he stood it up, is that considered enough of an action of human involvement? Or is that not really human involvement? Just standing it up, that's not much human involvement. You have to do something more to it, decorate it or something in order to really make it into an idol. But if he did not stand it up, certainly it would not be prohibited. Why? Because it's in its natural form. There's no human involvement. And so, since he asked the question only if he stood it up, but let's say he didn't stand it up. There's just an egg, a chicken came, laid an egg, and someone starts bowing down to it. What about that? It's not permitted. Why? Because it's in its natural form. There's no human involvement in it. Therefore, the boulder also, since there's no human involvement, even though it got separated from and a mountain that was worshipped as an idol, nevertheless, the boulder stays permitted, the boulder like the egg. So therefore, to be from the sons of Rabbi Chaya, from the fact that Chizkiya even asked this question, how about if you stand it up? Is that enough? That's his question. By standing it up, it's just like a boulder, just like if you take the boulder and you turn it into an idol, certainly that will make it prohibited, and if you worship it. But the egg, if you make it into a whole Easter egg and paint it and worship it as an idol, certainly be prohibited. But if just standing it up, is that enough of human involvement to make it prohibited or not? That's his question. But that means that you have to have human involvement in order to make for something to be prohibited, even if it's detached. So therefore, if it's no human involvement, then we can see that Rabbi Chaya is the one that permits. Isn't that a good proof? Lo le'olam emalach b'nei Rabbi Chaya de'asreh. No, in fact, it's not a good proof. It could be that the sons of Rabbi Chaya, including Chizkiya, they're the ones that say that the boulder is prohibited. Tishtachava la afagav de'lo zekava asura. And so to the egg that's separated, if someone bowed down to it, even if they didn't set it up and didn't do anything, it still be prohibited, just like the boulder, if someone bowed down to it, would be prohibited because it's detached. from where it came from. Rather, the question was about if someone took an egg and stood it up with intention to bow down to it, but did not yet bow down to it. He'd only stood it up. The question is just preparing an idol, does that already make it idolatrous? And for this, there is a distinction between a Jew and a non-Jew. For a non-Jew, if a non-Jew designates something as an idol, it does not yet become an idol. Unlike if a Jew designates something as hekdesh, it already becomes hekdesh even before it's actually sacrificed. That's the difference between idolatry and hekdesh. And so now we're wondering about this, and let's see. What are the what's the question? Ulman, this question that you're asking, whether setting up an egg by itself and designating it as an idol, is that sufficient to make it prohibited, even though he did not actually sacrifice it? Ulman, according to whom are you asking this question? If you're going to follow the opinion that says, there's a machloket that's going to come up later, that an idolatry of a Jew is prohibited immediately once it's designated as an idol, then here, the same thing. This egg was designated to be an idol, but it was not yet, even though it was not yet worshipped, is going to be prohibited. So then this is going to be prohibited. But if you follow the other opinion that says that even for a Jew, an item that's designated to be idolatrous is not prohibited until it's actually worshipped, well, he didn't worship it, so the egg should be prohibited. So he should be permitted. So in other words, why would Chizkiah be asking a question? If that's the question, then what's the question? There's no dilemma. It depends what you follow. This is just a regular classic case of an item that was a permitted item that was designated to be an idolatry, but not yet used as idolatry. And we know there's two opinions. That when it belongs to a Jew, if there's one opinion that says prohibited, and that would be prohibited. Another opinion that says it's permitted until it's worshipped, and then it would be permitted. So then that can't be the situation, because then we would know the answer. Well, the question was, if a Jew took this egg, stood it up, with intention to worship it as an idol, but he did not yet worship it as an idol, and then a non-Jew came and worshipped it as an idol. That we're not sure what the outcome would be. Now we do have a ruling about a similar case when it comes to a brick. Shemuel says that if a Jew took a brick and stood it upright, with intention that he's going to bow down to it as an idol, and he didn't do it yet, but then a non-Jew came and bowed down to it, it does become prohibited. So we do know the law regarding a brick, but the question is, can that transfer over also to an egg? Now the question that Chizkiah was asking is regarding a brick, where it's clear if someone's setting up a brick on a pedestal, putting it upright, it's clear that he's making it an idol, and that's why when the non-Jew comes and bows down to it, it makes it prohibited. But an egg is smaller; it's not so noticeable that he's setting it up as an idol, and therefore maybe the egg would remain permitted until a Jew himself came and actually worshipped it. Or maybe it's the same law between a brick and an egg, and if the non-Jew came and worshipped it, it would be prohibited, and that's the question that Chizkiah was asking. We don't know the answer to that question. We leave it as a teku, but since we can interpret the question in that way, it's not a proof that the sons of Rabbi Chiya are the ones that said that the boulder is permitted. Okay, now a new question. Rami Bar Chama asks, someone who worships a mountain. We've already established that the mountain remains permitted for a person to use. You can go and you can quarry from that mountain, and you can plant on that mountain, and you can hike on the mountain. All that is permitted. Even though someone worshipped the mountain, doesn't make the mountain prohibited for regular use, secular use. However, the question now is, what about using something from that mountain or something that grows on that mountain for the Mizbeach? For example, if you have a wheat that's growing, so the wheat would be permitted for secular use because it's connected to the mountain, but what about to be used as a Korban Mincha? Now, the reason why this is a good question is because we do have a distinction when it comes to an animal. If a live animal is worshipped as an idol, then it's permitted for secular use, but prohibited to bring on the Mizbeach. So, how about for a mountain? Would we apply the same prohibition on the mountain or things that grow on the mountain, that they also be prohibited on the Mizbeach, or do they remain permitted, just like they're permitted for secular use? Here's the question. Yesh na'evad b'mchubad esel gavoa, or en na'evad b'mchubad esel gavoa? Do you call something that is worshipped as idolatry, do you call it idolatry, even though it's connected to the ground when it comes to gavoa, so therefore it's prohibited to use on the Mizbeach? Or do we say, no, there's no such thing as something that's worshipped when it's connected to the ground, even for the Mizbeach? If it's connected to the ground, it remains permitted, not only for secular use, even for holy use. Im timse lomar, yesh ne'ebad mechubad esel gavoa, machshire korban ke korban damu ola. And second question that we add to that, even if you say that something that grows as attached to the ground, we do consider that worship to make it prohibited to be on the Mizbeach. You can't offer it like the wheat that you want to offer as a flour offering on the Mizbeach. What if it's only used to facilitate a sacrifice, like building the altar itself? You want to build the altar out of stones. Can you use stones that you got from a mountain that was worshipped? Since the altar itself, you're not sacrificing the altar itself. It's only something that's used to facilitate the ability to be able to bring a sacrifice. So even if you say that the wheat that's attached to the ground that's worshipped, that is no good because it was worshipped as an idol, but that's because you're putting it on the sacrifice. That is the offering itself, but something that will only help you to bring a korban. How about that? Can you use it even if it was worshipped while it was attached to the ground? That's the question. Amar Rava, kal vachomer, uma etnan shemutar betalush lehejot, asur b'mchubar legavoa, dichtib, lo tavi etnan zonam chir keleb, לא שינה תלוש ולא שינה במחובר, נאבד שאסור בתלוש להג'ות, אינו דין שאסור במחובר לגבוה. Rava is going to prove with a kal vachomer that if something is connected to the ground or the mountain itself is worshipped, then it cannot be used. It cannot be used on the Mizbeach itself, like wheat that's growing from it, or it cannot be used even as an appurtenance, like to quarry some stones from that mountain that is worshipped and then use it to build a Mizbeach. Both of these are prohibited. And as you know, kal vachomer from etnan. This is a payment that's given to a prostitute. Let's say she's paid with a goat. Right? She gets a goat as payment. Or she's paid with something connected to the ground, like a tree. Now these things, this payment is permitted to a hejot, to use for secular purposes. If she gets a goat for doing this sin, she gets paid by a goat. The goat is permitted for secular use. She can sell it, she can slaughter it and share the food, and the person's permitted to eat it. It doesn't make it prohibited, and it doesn't matter whether it's connected to the ground like a tree. Even if it's not connected to the ground like a goat, it remains permitted. That's the law. And yet, even though it's permitted for secular use, it's prohibited to use for gavoa. And it doesn't matter here whether it's attached to the ground or not. It's saying attached, meaning even attached to the ground, which would generally be more lenient, is still prohibited. As the pasuk says, do not bring the payment to a zonah, or the price of a dog, which is related to that. Do not bring it bet Hashem, to the house of Hashem. In fact, this is bet Hashem means you cannot use it for sure not for a sacrifice. You cannot even use it to build Bet Hashem. You can't use it for any holy purpose, even as an appurtenance to a korban. And so it doesn't matter whether it's not attached to the ground or whether it is attached to the ground. It's prohibited. Therefore, something that is itself actually worshipped as an idol, and if it's worshipped when it's not connected to the ground, like a statue, that will be prohibited for a secular use. Even a regular person cannot get any benefit from that statue. Since that's true, then we should learn that something that itself is actually worshipped would be prohibited to gavoa, even if it's connected to the ground. Okay, there's multiple steps here of logic, but the basic idea is that we're going to learn from etnan, something that's given as payment to a zonah is permitted across the board for secular use. Even though it's permitted for secular use, it's prohibited for any use in gavoa. So if something that is relatively lenient, because it's permitted for secular use, and yet is totally prohibited in the Bet HaMikdash for all things, then all the more so, something that is prohibited for secular use, at least while it's if it's worshipped as an idol when it's disconnected, that's prohibited even for anyone. All the more so, it's going to be prohibited across the board for use in the Bet HaMikdash, whether it's on the Mizbeach or whether it's used as an appurtenance to the Mizbeach. So that's Ravaz Kal Vachomer. So therefore, he's going to answer that question and say, no, something that is attached, part of the mountain, or something attached to the ground, if it's worshipped, although it's permitted for secular use, it's prohibited for any use in the Bet HaMikdash because it's worse than etnan zonah. Amar le Rav Huna bered Rav Yoshua le Rava. However, Rav Huna, the son of Yoshua, tells Rava, O chiluf, I can argue the opposite way and use this kal vachomer in the opposite direction to prove that such a case would actually be permitted in the case of the etnan zonah. If something is actually worshipped as an idol, that makes it prohibited to any use if it's not connected to the ground, like just a statue. Mutar b'mchubar lagavoa, shenemar Elohem al harim, velo harim Elohem, lo shena lehejot, velo shena lagavoa. And yet, it's permitted if it's attached to the ground. If something is attached to the ground, like a tree growing or the mountain itself, it's permitted even to gavoa. Now we're going to answer Ram Bar Chama's question the opposite way. This is his question, something attached to the ground is permitted. And how would I know that that's permitted? Because it says something is only prohibited if it's a statue, something that's worshipped on the mountain. But the mountain itself, or anything attached to the mountain that's growing from it, that even though it's worshipped as a god, is not prohibited. And it would make no difference. This permission would apply for secular use and for holy use. Etnan shemutar betalush lehejot and odin shemutar mechubar lagavoa. Since that we established that, then the payment of etnan, which is permitted if it's disconnected to the ground to a regular person, like a payment of a goat, which if is given to a zonah, is permitted to a regular person, so it's less severe. All the more so, it will be permitted if it's attached to the ground to gavoa. In other words, if something is attached to the ground and is worshipped as an idol, and it's permitted to use for gavoa, then the payment of to a zonah, which is less severe, certainly should be permitted to use for gavoa when it is attached to the ground. And so you can use this, take this kal vachomer. See, there's a lot of unknowns. We don't know whether something that's attached to the ground, that's involved in a prohibition, whether that can be used for gavoa. We don't know the law regarding if something is attached to the ground that's worshipped as an idol, whether that can be used for gavoa. That was the question that we started with. We also don't know whether something that's attached to the ground and given as payment to a zonah can be used for gavoa. And so now we can take this kal vachomer and point in either direction and assume that one is prohibited and therefore the other is also prohibited, or we can look at it in the other direction and say, well, let's assume one is permitted and therefore the other one is also permitted. So we can take it both ways. So therefore Rav Huna says, I'm going to argue the other way and say it's permitted. And I'm going to anticipate an objection that you might have. V'mishum bet Hashem Elokecha miba'ele leched bet Adonai Elohecha perat lefara she'ena ba'a lebayit divrei Rabbi Eliezer hachamim omrim lerabot et harikoim. If you're going to bring an objection from the fact that it says bet Hashem Elokecha, so isn't that extra words as coming to add that something is prohibited? Well, I'll tell you that I'll quote to you the Baraita that these words bet Hashem Elokecha is not coming to prohibit something that was attached to the ground, that was given to a zonah, and that's prohibited to bring. That's not what it's coming to include, but rather it's coming to actually exclude a para aduma. Let's say a para aduma was given to a zonah, a nice, beautiful red cow. This was given as payment to a zonah. And now the sages come and say, oh, what a nice para aduma. We want to use it for para aduma. Is that permitted? And the answer is yes, because it's not brought to the house of Hashem. It's slaughtered on Har Hazetim. It's not brought as a korban, and therefore that's permitted. And that the words Bet Hashem Elokecha says that only something that's brought to the Bet HaMikdash is prohibited, but if it's not brought to the Bet HaMikdash, it's permitted. That's what the Rabbi Eliezer uses it for. Hachamim use it actually for astringency, to come to include beaten plates of gold. Let's say some gold is given as a gift, as a payment to a zonah, and then you want to use that for decoration in the Bet HaMikdash. That is prohibited, because even though you're not using it as a sacrifice, it's in the house of Hashem, and that's also prohibited. One way or another, these words, Bet Hashem Elokecha, are coming to teach us some other law, and not to teach us any stringency regarding something attached to the ground that you're going to use in the Bet HaMikdash. And therefore, I can argue that's all permitted. Amar le, ana kamina lechumra, v'at amar lekula, kula v'chumra lechumra parchinan. Rava challenged Rav Huna, says, I said this kavachomer as a stringency, and you're arguing the other way as a leniency. When we have a kavachomer, and there's two ways to argue it, for leniency and stringency, we always follow the stringency. Parchinan usually means to ask a question, and here it's actually a proof, but a kavachomer is formulated as a question. Right, if A, then all the more so B. Wouldn't you say that? So we're saying we question, but really means that we're bringing a proof. So that's the general rule, that we should always follow the stringent way of interpreting it, and therefore Rava says, I'm following the stringency. Amar le Rav Papa le Rava, v'chol hechadika kula v'chumra lekula la parchinan. Rav Papa asked Rava, is that true, your rule, that anytime you have a kavachomer, and you can use it for leniency or for stringency, that you don't apply it for leniency, you have to assume stringency? V'ahaza'ad de Pesach tifligi Rabbi Eliezer v'Rabbi Akiva. The Rabbi Eliezer saba l'chumra v'kamechayev le'legavra v'Rabbi Akiva lekula ufatar v'kaparich Rabbi Akiva lekula. Look at the case of sprinkling of para aduma waters regarding Pesach, where there's a machloket between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva. The case is where the 14th of Nisan falls out on Shabbat. The 14th of Nisan, that's when you have to bring Korban Pesach. Now, generally, you can bring a Korban on Shabbat that you have to bring for Shabbat itself, like Korban Tamid or Musaf on Shabbat, or if Shabbat is a holiday itself, is a Yom Tov, then you can bring those that overrides, Korbanot, override Shabbat if it's something that's needed for the day of Shabbat. However, the problem with Korban Pesach is that Korban Pesach is prepared on the 14th, but it's actually eaten on the 15th. It's at night. And so now you're going to violate Shabbat, slaughter and take the blood and all that and cook. And then you're not going to eat it until that night. So you're violating Shabbat, not for something that you actually need on Shabbat. So this is a huge controversy, whether you can slaughter, prepare Korban Pesach on Shabbat, that is the 14th. Now, there's an added complication here, which is if someone is tameh lamet, then in order to eat any korban, and korban pesach included, they have to become tahor, and they have to get para aduma water sprinkled on the 3rd and the 7th. What if the 7th day, since they started their process of tahara, is that day, Shabbat, which is the 14th? Now, normally, if it's the 14th, it's good. They can get sprinkled on the 14th and then eat it at night. But what if that's Shabbat? Are you allowed to sprinkle para aduma waters on Shabbat? That's asur midirabanan, because you're preparing the mixture. And so that's asur midirabanan. So that's another question. Can you get para aduma waters sprinkled on Shabbat as the 14th so that you will be able to eat Korban Pesach? This is a machloket between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Eliezer saba lechumra b'kamechayev le'legabra. Rabbi Eliezer is stringent and requires a person to do Korban Pesach, which means that Rabbi Eliezer is going to say not only that you can slaughter and sprinkle the blood of Korban Pesach on Shabbat, he says you can also sprinkle paraduma waters on Shabbat. And he can bring a kal vachomer. If you can do deoraita melacha on Shabbat by slaughtering the animal so that you can have it that night, then all the more so you should be able to violate a derabanan, just of sprinkling the paraduma waters so that you can have Korban Pesach at night. So the Rabbi Eliezer says it's permitted to sprinkle paraduma waters on Shabbat. That's the 14th. That's called chumrah, because then he's machmir, because that means that the person has to bring Korban Pesach. And Rabbi Akiva lekula ufatar. Rabbi Akiva is lenient and says, no, you don't have to bring Korban Pesach. If that's your situation, then you're tameh lamet. You're not allowed to sprinkle paraduma waters. And in that discussion, Rabbi Akiva challenged Rabbi Eliezer with a kal vachomer, and he interpreted the kal vachomer for leniency, because you could take this kal vachomer both ways. Ditnan, as we see in the Mishnah Masechet Pesachim. Heshiv Rabbi Akiva o chiluf, ma za'ashim mishum shivut ena docha Shabbat, shechita shi doraita, lo kol sheken. Rabbi Akiva flipped around the same kal vachomer that Rabbi Eliezer taught, and he says, I'll argue the opposite. If haza'ah, sprinkling of paraduma waters, is prohibited on Shabbat, and that prohibition is only midrabanan, it's only because of shivut, and it does not override Shabbat, and you cannot become tahor, and you don't bring Korban Pesach, then all the more so, slaughtering the Korban Pesach itself, and slaughtering would be a melacha deoraita, all the more so, you cannot do that on Shabbat. This is not a Korban for that day, it's a Korban for that night, and so it's prohibited. And this is a kula, because it means that the person doesn't have to bring the Korban. And so here we see that when you have a kal vachomer, you can interpret it for stringency or for leniency, and Rabbi Akiva interprets it for leniency. Therefore, the Papa asked Rava, why do you say that you always interpret, if a kal vachomer can go both ways, you always interpret for stringency? Here, Rabbi Akiva himself interpreted for leniency. And the Gemara answers, Hatam, Rabbi Eliezer gemare, ve'aikar le talmuda, v'ata Rabbi Akiva le'adkure. In that case, Rabbi Eliezer is the one that taught Rabbi Akiva this law in the first place. However, Rabbi Eliezer was elder and he forgot this point. And then Rabbi Akiva came and he just wanted to remind Rabbi Eliezer of what Rabbi Eliezer already taught. In other words, this kal vachomer is not the actual origin of the law. Rabbi Akiva is only using this kal vachomer to jog Rabbi Eliezer's memory. And we know this is true because v'hainu da'amar le Rabbi al tachpireni b'shat hadin kach mekubal ani mimecha hazah shivut v'ena docha et hashabbat. This explains what Rabbi Akiva tells Rabbi Eliezer when he says, my teacher, do not deny my contention during the judgment, during the deliberation on this matter, because I received a tradition from you yourself that sprinkling, even though it's only a rabbinic prohibition, does not override Shabbat. Sprinkling is not more important than Shabbat, but rather Shabbat is more important. And we do not do sprinkling on Shabbat. And I wanted to remind you of the fact, that's why I used the kal vachomer in that direction. But since this kal vachomer is not the actual origin of the law, but rather it's a tradition that he got from Rabbi Eliezer, therefore, this is not a disproof against Rava's principle. And so Rava's principle stands that when you have an ambiguous kal vachomer, then we use it for stringency. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen ve'amen.